Every war has its heroes, its villains, and its blunderers. The American Civil War was no exception. Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman forged reputations of brilliance. But lurking behind their victories were men whose incompetence stretched the war, deepened its misery, and buried hundreds of thousands more than necessary. And if arrogance was a disease in the 1860s, Jefferson Davis was its most fevered patient. He seemed, on paper, a man born for leadership. A West Point graduate, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce. His pedigree promised competence. And when secession fever swept through the South, Davis appeared the natural choice to lead the Confederacy. But a glittering resume is no substitute for vision. What followed was not genius, but a slow-motion disaster, a rebellion, strangled not only by Union power, but by the hand of its own president. The irony was bitter. The Confederacy was founded on the principle of states' rights of resisting the meddling hand of a faraway government. Yet Davis, once installed, ruled like a monarch. He centralized authority, quarreled endlessly with governors, and treated his generals as subordinates to be disciplined rather than partners to be trusted. Instead of forging unity from a fragile coalition, he smothered it under his own rigidity. The South could afford no such missteps. Its population numbered just 9 million, nearly half enslaved, unable and unwilling to fight for the cause of their bondage. Its industrial base was a fraction of the North's. In fact, Northern factories produced 97% of the nation's firearms, a staggering imbalance, where the Union had sprawling rail networks and munitions depots. The Confederacy leaned on a brittle backbone of agriculture and wishful thinking. This was a rebellion that needed cunning, flexibility, and cooperation to survive. Davis supplied the opposite. What did his micromanagement yield? Hungry soldiers and routing supplies. When the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg came under siege in 1863, soldiers were reduced to eating rats, mules, and, if reports are to be believed, boiled leather scraped from shoes. Mothers back home wept not only for their dead sons, but for the starvation that gnawed at their living ones. By 1864, Confederate inflation had spiraled to 9,000%. Imagine walking into a market and watching the price of a sack of flour triple before your eyes. Money turned to dust. Goods disappeared from shelves. Even salt, so ordinary in peacetime, became a commodity worth fighting over. Governors, once Davis's allies, hoarded supplies and rage at his heavy hand. Instead of cooperation, resentment festered. Instead of victory, desperation deepened. Soldiers deserted not because they lacked bravery, but because they lacked shoes, shirts, and bread. In a rebellion meant to preserve liberty, Davis had delivered scarcity, hunger, and humiliation. And yet, he never learned. Davis clung to the belief that discipline and centralization would conjure victory. He meddled in minor assignments, sacked generals who defied him, and ignored warnings that supplies lay untouched in depots while men starved a few miles away. He repeated the same mistakes year after year, as if sheer willpower could rewrite reality. His micromanagement was not merely a flaw, it was a death sentence for his cause. By 1865, the disaster was complete. Confederate armies disintegrated across every front. Atlanta, the Shenandoah Valley, the Carolinas all, lost in rapid succession. Richmond itself, the rebel capital, fell. And still Davis clung to delusion, fleeing south and ordering his shattered soldiers to stand firm as their comrades deserted in droves. More than 100,000 men are estimated to have walked away rather than serve a government that could not feed them. It ended not with glory, but with capture. In April 1865, Jefferson Davis was taken prisoner in Georgia. The rebellion he had micromanaged to death collapsed around him, leaving a legacy of suffering and futility. Some defenders argue that his centralization was necessary, that without it, the Confederacy would have dissolved even faster. But history is merciless in its verdict. Davis's style starved his armies without creating unity. He had ruled rebels like subjects, and in doing so, he turned allies into enemies and a cause into a coffin. In the end, Jefferson Davis was not the master of the Confederate destiny, he was its saboteur. Micromanagement had been the royal road to ruin. If Jefferson Davis smothered his own rebellion with arrogance, the Union stumbled for a different reason. Navit, in 1861, the North still clung to the fantasy that the Civil War would be quick, clean, and over in 90 days. Newspapers shouted it, politicians promised it, and ordinary citizens believed it. Victory parades were imagined before battles had even been fought. But on July 21st, 1861, reality arrived with a vengeance along the banks of a modest Virginian creek called Bull Run. Leading the Union Army of northeastern Virginia was General Irvin McDowell, a logistics man by training. McDowell knew how to move wagons and supplies, but he had almost no battlefield experience. He warned President Lincoln and his cabinet. His men were raw, barely trained, and nowhere near ready for a pitched battle. They ignored him. Political pressure overrode military caution. The people wanted victory, and Washington wanted it fast. So McDowell marched south with 35,000 volunteers boys in uniform who had been drilling for weeks, not months. They carried muskets, but many carried them as if they were parade props rather than weapons of survival. Their inexperience was matched only by the absurdity of what followed. Civilians from Washington packed picnic baskets and carriages, eager to watch the great Union triumph unfold. Women in hoop skirts, men in fine hats, even children all jostled for a view as if this were a sporting match rather than a battle for the nation's soul. At first, it seemed the spectacle might deliver the promised glory. Union brigades crossed Bull Run Creek and shoved Confederate defenders back. Dust rose, musket fire cracked, and victory seemed tantalizingly close. But war is not theater, and the South had no intention of playing the victim. By midday, reinforcements under General Thomas Jonathan Jackson arrived. Jackson planted himself and his Virginians on Henry House Hill, refusing to give an inch. His defiance earned him the nickname that would haunt the Union for years: Stonewall. Union attacks faltered, and McDowell hesitated. He could not press the advantage, could not seize the moment. And in war, hesitation is a death sentence. The Confederate counterattack stiffened. Momentum slipped away like water through clenched fists. Then came the breaking point. The Union line buckled, and panic spread like fire through dry grass. Soldiers abandoned wagons, flung down muskets, and ran. The proud army of northeastern Virginia dissolved into chaos, and the civilians, those foolish spectators with their picnic baskets, were caught in the flood. Their carriages blocked retreating soldiers. Wagons overturned, food trampled into the mud. Women screamed as horses bolted. The road back to Washington became a single, endless bottleneck of panic. An army that had marched out with drums and flags returned as a mob, humiliated and broken. The losses themselves were not catastrophic by the brutal standards of what the war would soon become. Roughly 2,900 Union casualties to 1,750 Confederate, but the symbolism was devastating. The illusion of a quick war shattered that day. The South, emboldened by victory, roared with confidence. The North was forced to face a hard truth. This rebellion would not end in months. It would drag on for years, grinding through lives like a millstone. McDowell's blunder was not simply tactical, it was philosophical. He assumed enthusiasm could substitute for training, that zeal could replace discipline. It was the same dangerous logic that had led crowds to bring picnic baskets to a battlefield. But battles are not won by enthusiasm. They are won by preparation, endurance, and command. At Bull Run, the Union had none of those things. The results: a nation plunged into a war it barely understood. A people sobered by the sight of their sons streaming home in disgrace. And a lesson written in blood: enthusiasm without discipline is not a weapon, but a liability. If McDowell rushed headlong into disaster, his successor represented the opposite extreme. Where McDowell had gambled on enthusiasm, George B. McClellan gambled on perfection and lost everything to hesitation. At first, McClellan looked like salvation. The press called him the young Napoleon. His men adored him. He drilled raw recruits until they looked like a professional army. He could organize supply lines with mathematical precision. When the Union needed discipline after Bull Run, McClellan delivered it. But the same qualities that made him a brilliant trainer became poison in battle. McClellan's flaw was as fatal as overconfidence. He believed that no move should be made until the stars aligned perfectly. And in war, perfection never comes. By 1862, McClellan commanded more than 100,000 men in the Army of the Potomacan Army that dwarfed its Confederate opponents. Yet he constantly imagined himself outnumbered, sometimes by double. Scouts reported Confederate weakness. Lincoln himself urged him to act. But McClellan froze. His letters to Washington revealed a man convinced of shadows, inflating enemy numbers in his mind until every step forward looked like a death trap. Lincoln would fume in private. He has the slows. Then came the Peninsula Campaign. Instead of striking directly at Richmond, McClellan spent months drilling and maneuvering down the Virginia Peninsula, always waiting for reinforcements, always certain he lacked just a few more men. Weeks turned into months, momentum bled away, and the war ground on. The most damning moment came that September, on the fields of Antietam. A miracle had fallen into McClellan's lap. Union scouts discovered a lost Confederate order, Special Order 191, outlining Robert E. Lee's entire plan of battle. Imagine stumbling upon your enemy's secret playbook, every troop movement spelled out. For most generals, it would be a gift from the gods. For McClellan, it was another reason to hesitate. On September 17, 1862, McClellan commanded the largest Union force ever assembled. He deployed them not with boldness, but with caution piecemeal, holding back reserves even as the battle raged. In the cornfields, men were cut down in waves. At the sunken road, blood pooled until it earned a grim new name: Bloody Lane. Union soldiers begged for reinforcements that never came. Thousands stood idle while their comrades died yards away. By sunset, 23,000 men had fallen the single bloodiest day in American history. And still, Lee's army lived to fight again. McClellan had held the chance to crush the rebellion in his hands and let it slip. Lee retreated into Virginia, battered but intact. The war stretched on 4 years longer, the blood price climbing higher with every season. To his credit, McClellan built an army where chaos had reigned. He gave men pride, discipline, and order. Many soldiers loved him for sparing their lives through caution. But history measures victories, not parades. McClellan's refusal to strike turned strength into weakness, advantage into stalemate. His name became synonymous, not with triumph, but with hesitation. What made his failure so damning was not ignorance, but awareness. He saw the opportunity. He had the intelligence reports, the numbers, the miracle of Lee's lost order. Yet he refused to believe them. His imagination doubled his enemy, and his fear strangled his courage. The North bled because its general wanted certainty in a world where certainty does not exist. Paralysis by analysis was McClellan's curse, and for the Union, it was a curse paid in blood. If George McClellan bled the Union by doing too little, John Bell, who'd bled the Confederacy by doing far too much. He was the gambler of the Civil War, reckless, wounded, and desperate enough to bet everything, even when the stakes were impossible. Hood's rise had been meteoric. Under Robert E. Lee, he'd won a reputation as one of the South's fiercest young commanders. His Texans worshipped him, his peers respected him, and his courage was undeniable. But war carved its price into his body. At Gettysburg, a wound left him crippled in one arm. Months later, at Chickamauga, he lost a leg. By 1864, the dashing young officer was a shattered man physically, but elevated to high command nonetheless. Courage had carried him to the top, but caution and restraint were qualities he never possessed. When Hood replaced Joseph E. Johnston at the helm of the Army of Tennessee, he promised what Johnston could not: aggression. Richmond was frustrated with Johnston's retreats in the face of Sherman's advance on Atlanta. Hood offered the opposite. He threw his battered soldiers into repeated assaults, bleeding them white against Sherman's fortified lines. The result was inevitable. Atlanta fell in September 1864. A loss so catastrophic that it guaranteed Lincoln's re-election and sealed the Confederacy's political doom. But Hood was not finished. Instead of retreating, he doubled down, determined to march into Tennessee and force Sherman to turn back. It was a gambler's logic ignoring that Sherman had no intention of chasing him. The Union general simply continued his devastating march through Georgia, leaving George H. Thomas and Union forces in Tennessee to deal with Hood's army. Then came Franklin. November 30th, 1864. Hood ordered 20,000 of his men to charge across nearly 2 miles of open ground at dusk against entrenched Union positions. There was no adequate artillery preparation, no surprise, no logic. Soldiers could scarcely believe the order when it came down. One Confederate later said it felt like marching into the mouth of hell. What followed was slaughter. For 5 hours, musket fire and artillery tore into the gray ranks. Entire brigades were cut down before reaching the Union lines. 6 Confederate generals were killed, 8 more wounded or captured. Over 6,000 men fell in a single evening. Friends' brothers, fathers vanishing into the smoke and mud. Survivors remembered stepping over carpets of the dead, the groans of the wounded mixing with the roar of cannon. And still Hood pressed on. He blamed his men for lacking discipline rather than himself for gambling their lives away. The Army of Tennessee, once proud and battle-hardened, was reduced to a shell of itself. Yet Hood marched them north toward Nashville, where they faced Union forces outnumbering them 2-1. December 1864 delivered the final blow. George Thomas struck with cold precision, flanking Hood's army again and again. Over 2 days, the Confederate lines collapsed. Thousands more were captured or killed. The Army of Tennessee ceased to exist as a meaningful fighting force. To stand in Hood's shoes is to glimpse a tragic contradiction. His personal bravery had once inspired troops. He fought in the thick of battle until his body could no longer bear it. But bravery without judgment is not leadership. It is recklessness. And recklessness in command is paid for, not with dice or cards, but with the lives of men. John Bell, who'd gambled away the Confederacy's last major army in the West. He staked it all on boldness, on one more charge, one more throw of the dice. And when the final reckoning came, his soldiers lay in fields they could never rise from. Casualties of a commander who could not distinguish courage from folly. If Hood's recklessness destroyed an army in the West, Robert Ely's miscalculation at Gettysburg shattered Confederate hopes in the East. It was July 3rd, 1863, the third day of battle. The fields of Pennsylvania were littered with the dead, both Union and Confederate. Lee believed he saw his chance. The Union center, battered from 2 days of fighting, seemed vulnerable. Victory, he thought, was within reach. One bold strike might break the Union line and end the war on Northern soil. What followed has gone down in infamy as Pickett's Charge. Some 12,500 Confederate soldiers formed in ranks and marched across nearly a mile of open ground under the blazing sun. Artillery thundered. Smoke clouded the fields, but Union guns were not silenced. Fences along the Emmitsburg Road slowed the advance, turning orderly lines into stumbling targets. Shells burst overhead, canister tore through flesh. Muskets rattled without pause. Soldiers fell in heaps before they had crossed half the distance. For a brief, terrible moment, General Lewis Armistead's brigade breached the Union line at the Stonewall. But Armistead fell mortally wounded, and no reserves stood ready to exploit the gap. The assault collapsed. By the time it was over, more than half of the attacking force lay dead, wounded, or captured. Pickett's entire division was gutted. No! 15,000 men, ever arrayed for battle, can take that position, James Longstreet had warned Lee. He was right. Gettysburg became the high-water mark of the Confederacy romantic words, masking the truth that it was the beginning of the end. But while armies bled in fields, another kind of chaos erupted at home. In July 1863, the Union introduced its first federal draft. It contained a loophole that turned fury into fire for $300 roughly a year. Wage for a laborer a man could buy his way out. The rich paid, the poor marched to war. In New York City, resentment exploded into violence. Draft offices burned. Police were beaten in the streets. Crowds lynched black New Yorkers in broad daylight, blaming them for a war they had never asked for. Homes and orphanages were torched. For 4 days, the city resembled a At least 120 people died, thousands were injured, and entire neighborhoods were scarred with ash and fear. This was the Union's shame. While men fought and died on battlefields, profiteers and Copperhead Democrats undermined the war effort for money or politics. Contractors supplied uniforms that dissolved in the rain, boots that disintegrated in mud. The very word shoddy entered the language because of worthless goods sent to soldiers. And while profiteers lined their pockets, working men seethed as the wealthy bought exemptions. The result was blood on the cobblestones of New York, proof that inequality can fracture a nation as surely as cannon fire. And then there was Fredericksburg. In December 1862, General Ambrose Burnside led 118,000 Union troops against Robert E. Lee's 78 Confederates. He had numbers, but he squandered them in one of the most lopsided failures of the entire war. Delays in bridge building allowed Lee to entrench on the heights behind the town. When Burnside finally attacked, he ordered wave after wave across open ground, straight into a wall of Confederate rifles and artillery at Maris Heights. Eyewitnesses recalled the horror. The Irish Brigade advanced with green flags flying. By nightfall, only a fraction returned. Survivors begged fresh regiments not to go forward, clutching at their coats to hold them back. But the orders kept coming. 13 separate charges were made. Not a single Union soldier breached the Confederate line. By evening, the field was carpeted with thousands of blue uniforms, the cries of the wounded echoing through the night. Union losses reached 12,600, more than double the Confederate casualties. Burnside's disaster was not just tactical, it was philosophical. He mistook speed for strategy, believing that swift action could compensate for poor planning. But bayonets do not beat stone walls, and courage cannot substitute for leadership. At Fredericksburg, Burnside turned opportunity into a graveyard. By the war's end, the pattern was clear. Arrogance, hesitation, recklessness, greed, different masks of the same folly. Davis starved his armies with micromanagement. McDowell assumed enthusiasm could replace discipline. McClellan froze until victory slipped away. Who'd gambled away irreplaceable lives. Lee sent his best men into the jaws of death. Burnside threw brigades into slaughter without sense. Profiteers and Copperheads undermined the cause from within. The cost was staggering. 620,000 dead, countless wounded, cities burned, families broken. These men were not the sole reason for the blood, but their mistakes deepened it, prolonged it, and made the suffering immeasurably worse. History remembers them not as villains or heroes, but as warnings. Leaders who mistook pride for wisdom, rigidity for strength, and recklessness for courage. Their legacies are written not in triumph, but in graves.